In the quiet of the night, when the streets are nearly empty and the world slows to a whisper, there exists a certain kind of story that seems designed to be told in the dark. This is the story of a man who has been called the most dangerous criminal alive, a man whose name alone once sent shivers through the offices of the FBI, Europol, and intelligence agencies across the globe. His name is Semion Mogilevich, and for decades, he has lived in the shadows, moving money, manipulating markets, and orchestrating crimes on a scale so vast it almost feels unreal. Tonight, we are going to step into his world, not with the rush of an action movie, but with the quiet, deliberate pace of a story told by a voice in the dark, letting every detail sink in like a slow, steady heartbeat. Picture Moscow in the dead of winter. Snow falls in a soft curtain, muting the sounds of the city, turning the busy streets into a frozen canvas of white. Somewhere in this sprawling metropolis, in a small cafe tucked away from the main road, a man sits alone at a table. He is neither flashy nor intimidating at first glance, no gold chains, no bodyguard standing in the open, no loud boasts or gunfire. He is calm, collected, his presence almost gentle. This is Semion Mogilevich, the man law enforcement around the world would later call the boss of bosses of Russian organized crime. He lights a cigarette, exhales, and watches the smoke curl into the dim air above his head. To the casual observer, he looks like any other man trying to stay warm on a cold night. But appearances are deceiving, and this man has quietly become one of the most powerful figures in the global underworld. The fascination with Mogilevich begins with his paradoxes. He was not the stereotypical gangster you might expect from movies about the mafia. There were no loud shootouts, no dramatic escapes in black sedans speeding down city streets. Instead, his weapon of choice was knowledge, of markets, of people, of politics, and he wielded it with surgical precision. Rather than ruling with brute force, he built an empire on fraud, laundering billions of dollars, and using legitimate businesses as fronts for illegal activity. It is said that he preferred brains over bullets, preferring to outthink rivals rather than outgun them. That calm, almost scholarly approach made him invisible, a ghost among the loud chaos of other criminal empires. This story is not just about crime, it is about power. The kind of power that is silent, creeping, and all the more terrifying because it does not need to announce itself. Imagine being able to move millions, sometimes billions, of dollars across borders with a single phone call, or to collapse a company's stock price with a single rumor. This was the level at which Mogilevich operated. Law enforcement agencies tried to track him, but time and time again, they discovered that he was always several steps ahead. To those who knew him, he was less a man and more a force of nature, a storm of intellect and strategy wrapped in the unassuming figure of a middle-aged man who preferred staying out of the spotlight. And yet, there is an undeniable allure to his story. Perhaps it is the sheer scale of what he accomplished, the reach of his network stretching across Europe, North America, and beyond. Perhaps it is the mystery surrounding his personal life, the way he managed to remain untouchable for so long, as though protected by some invisible shield. Or perhaps it is because his crimes were so deeply entwined with politics and global economics that his downfall would have shaken not just the criminal underworld, but entire financial systems. His story invites us to question where the line between crime and legitimate power really lies, and whether that line even exists at the highest levels of society. For years, his name appeared on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, alongside terrorists and cartel leaders. But unlike those men, Mogilevich seemed to vanish at will, slipping between countries, appearing briefly in public before retreating back into the shadows. He became a legend not just among criminals, but among those tasked with stopping them. Detectives, prosecutors, and intelligence officers spoke about him in hushed tones, almost with a kind of grudging respect. Some even admitted, off the record, that he was one of the most intelligent adversaries they had ever faced. This is the story you are about to hear tonight. A story not of explosions and gunfights, but of quiet deals struck in back rooms, of bank accounts opened and closed across continents, of governments and corporations unwittingly dancing to the tune of a man who never needed to raise his voice. This is a story of rise and survival, of a man who built an empire without leaving fingerprints, who played the game so well that he became almost untouchable. As we journey through the life of Semion Mogilevich, we will explore where he came from, how he built his network, and why even today, he remains a figure cloaked in mystery. We will move slowly, step by step, through his world, as if walking through a dimly lit corridor where each door reveals another secret. By the time this story ends, you may find yourself wondering not just how one man could amass such power, but whether his shadow still stretches across the world we live in now. So settle in, take a slow, deep breath, and let the night take hold. The world outside can wait. For now, there is only the soft voice of the story, the quiet hum of history unfolding, and the lingering question that will guide us through every chapter: how did one man, born in a world of scarcity and fear, rise to become the invisible architect of one of the largest criminal enterprises the world has ever known? And perhaps more hauntingly, how did he manage to do it while almost never leaving a trace? The story of Semion Mogilevich truly begins in the uneasy stillness of post-war Kiev, a city that bore the scars of a continent's greatest conflict. The year was 1946, and the ashes of World War II still lingered in every broken building, every whispered conversation about loss. Ukraine was a land struggling to breathe again under the tight grip of Soviet power, and in the middle of this uneasy recovery, a child was born into a Jewish family, one of countless families trying to survive the shortages, the suspicion, and the unspoken rules of Stalin's USSR. The streets were cold, lined with gray apartment blocks, the kind that turned neighbors into quiet observers of one another, always careful not to say too much. For a boy like Semion, this was the first lesson: in this world, survival meant knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. Imagine the Kiev of those years, trams creaking slowly along the tracks, the bitter wind blowing through courtyards, children playing with improvised toys because stores were empty of anything new. Food was scarce, lines outside bakeries stretched for blocks, and the black market was not just a criminal enterprise but a lifeline for those who wanted more than the state's rations allowed. It was a world of contrasts, public slogans promising equality and abundance, while in private kitchens, parents worried about how to get extra sugar or meat for the week. For young Semion, these contradictions were not frightening, they were simply the truth of the world. And from the start, he showed a remarkable ability to observe, to understand the hidden rules that governed life in this place. Semion was intelligent, and his family valued education even when resources were scarce. His parents worked hard, doing what they could in a system that often limited Jewish citizens from advancing too far in their careers. The Soviet Union was a place of quiet, bureaucratic anti-Semitism, where opportunities were rationed just like food. For some, this created bitterness; for others, resilience. In Semion's case, it seemed to create ambition, a determination to find a way around obstacles rather than through them. It is easy to imagine him as a quiet, watchful boy, listening more than he spoke, memorizing the rhythms of the street markets and the patterns of the people who came and went. As he grew older, Semion was drawn to books, to numbers, to the mechanics of how things worked. Unlike many street hustlers who learned crime through trial and error, he would later approach the underworld with the mind of a strategist. But before he could become a strategist, he had to become a survivor. In the neighborhoods of Kiev, small-time hustles were part of daily life, buying something cheap from one part of the city, selling it for a little profit somewhere else, or trading favors to get hard-to-find goods. These were not yet crimes in the sense of grand conspiracies, they were small acts of defiance, a way of bending the rules just enough to make life a little more comfortable. It is said that even as a teenager, Mogilevich showed a talent for organization. While other boys were content to make quick money and spend it the same night, Semion seemed to think ahead, saving, reinvesting, always planning the next step. This forward-looking nature set him apart, and soon he was noticed by the types of men who thrived in the cracks of the Soviet system: fixers, traders, and the occasional small-time gangster who needed someone smart enough to handle complicated exchanges. These early connections were not glamorous, they were quiet, sometimes dangerous, but they offered a kind of education that no school could provide. Still, Semion was not just a street learner. He was also a student in the formal sense, and his pursuit of education would shape the man he became. He eventually left Kiev for Lviv, where he studied economics at the university. This detail surprises many who expect a mob boss to come from nothing but street violence, but Mogilevich was different. The classrooms of Lviv became another layer of training ground, teaching him about markets, supply and demand, and the movement of money. Imagine the young man sitting at a worn wooden desk, poring over ledgers and textbooks, surrounded by other students who dreamed of stable jobs in the state economy. Semion's dreams were bigger. To him, knowledge was not just about earning a government position, it was a weapon, a tool he could use to build something beyond the reach of ordinary men. But even as he excelled in his studies, the world outside the university was changing. The black market was thriving, fueled by shortages and by a growing appetite for Western goods. A quiet undercurrent of corruption ran through Soviet life, from factory managers skimming supplies to bureaucrats taking bribes to look the other way. Semion began to weave his academic knowledge together with the lessons he had learned in the streets. He saw patterns where others saw chaos, and he began to understand that in a system this rigid, those who could find the loopholes held the real power. This combination, education, observation, and ambition, created the foundation for everything Mogilevich would later become. By the time he graduated, he was no longer just a bright young man with a degree. He was a thinker with one foot in the respectable world and one foot in the underground economy. And more importantly, he was beginning to see that the underground could be organized, structured, made efficient. Crime, in his mind, did not need to be reckless. It could be calculated, almost elegant, if one had the discipline and intelligence to run it like a business. This stage of his life was the preparation, the quiet gathering of tools that would later allow him to build an empire. When we look back at the child playing in Kiev courtyards or the student walking through the snowy streets of Lviv with books under his arm, we see the seeds of the man he would become, patient, deliberate, and always thinking several moves ahead. It is easy to forget that every criminal mastermind once had a beginning, a moment when they were just another face in the crowd. But for Mogilevich, those early years were where he learned the rules of a system he would one day bend to his will. And as the 1970s dawned, with the Soviet Union facing growing economic problems and black markets expanding faster than ever, Semion Mogilevich was ready to step out of the quiet background of his youth and begin his first real moves in the criminal world. What came next would not only change his life, but eventually draw the attention of governments far beyond the Soviet borders. His first major operation would set the tone for everything that followed, and it would prove that this quiet, watchful boy from Kiev was destined to become something far more formidable than anyone could have predicted. By the time Semion Mogilevich stepped into adulthood, the world around him was changing in ways that created both chaos and opportunity. The Soviet Union of the late 1960s and early 1970s was a place where the official economy could no longer keep up with the needs of its people. Shelves were empty, inflation was quietly eating away at wages, and nearly everyone, ordinary citizens, factory workers, even bureaucrats, was involved in some form of under-the-table trade. For someone like Mogilevich, armed with both an economics degree and a sharp instinct for human behavior, this was fertile ground. The young man who once observed life from the sidelines was ready to step into the game, and he did so not with violence, but with precision and strategy. His first known crimes were not the kind of bloody turf wars or robberies that fill the pages of gangster novels. Instead, they were carefully planned frauds, schemes that targeted weaknesses in the system rather than people directly. It began with art and antiques, rare paintings, religious icons, and valuable jewelry that were smuggled out of the Soviet Union and sold to wealthy buyers in the West. These operations were intricate, requiring connections to black market traders, forgers, and smugglers who could move goods across heavily guarded borders. For Semion, this was not just about quick profits, it was about learning how to build a network, how to create trust among criminals who trusted no one, and how to cover his tracks so completely that authorities had nothing but rumors to follow. Imagine the atmosphere of these early deals, smoke-filled apartments where men spoke in low voices over tea glasses, deals sealed not with formal contracts but with nods and handshakes, and a young Mogilevich sitting quietly, absorbing every detail. He was not a man who needed to dominate the room with threats. Instead, he projected calm and confidence, which often proved more disarming than intimidation. In a world where fear was the usual currency, Semion offered something different: reliability. If he promised to move goods, they moved. If he promised a payout, it was delivered. This consistency became his reputation, and reputation, in the underworld, is more valuable than gold. But fraud was not a game without risk. The Soviet authorities were ruthless when it came to cracking down on black market operations, and arrests were frequent. At some point in these early years, Mogilevich himself was caught and served a short prison sentence for currency-related crimes. Rather than breaking him, this experience seemed to refine him. Prison in the Soviet Union was often described as a school for criminals, a place where minor offenders learned from hardened veterans of the underworld. Behind those gray walls, Semion found mentors, men who had run large-scale operations before and who recognized the intelligence and potential in the quiet young man. When he was released, he did not return to a normal life. He returned sharper, more connected, and more determined than ever. What made Mogilevich unique was that he treated crime like an enterprise. While others spent their energy fighting over scraps, he was thinking bigger. He began orchestrating more elaborate scams, schemes involving fake contracts, phantom businesses, and complex paper trails that confused investigators. He understood that the best way to hide crime was to bury it under layers of bureaucracy. The police might catch a street thief red-handed, but catching a man who manipulated shipping documents, bank forms, and invoices was another matter entirely. It was during this period that he began to step into the role of organizer, no longer just a participant but the mind behind the operation. One of the early hallmarks of his operations was his ability to make allies out of almost anyone. He cultivated relationships with corrupt officials who could provide useful information or look the other way when necessary. He worked with forgers who could create the perfect set of papers, with transporters who knew the quiet back roads to the borders, and with fence operators who had buyers lined up abroad. Semion's genius lay not in doing everything himself, but in knowing exactly who to trust with each piece of the puzzle. He was assembling his first real network, one that would soon grow far beyond the Soviet Union. And yet, even with this rising power, he kept a low profile. He avoided unnecessary violence, preferring to resolve disputes through negotiation or quiet payoffs. This not only kept his operations running smoothly but also kept law enforcement attention to a minimum. Violence was noisy, and Mogilevich preferred silence. This approach gave him a reputation as a man who could handle problems without turning them into wars, and this reputation would become the key to his future alliances with much larger criminal groups. It is also during this time that we begin to see the shape of the man he would become. The calm strategist, the planner who always stayed 3 moves ahead, the man who could sit across the table from dangerous figures and never blink, this persona was being forged in these early years. He learned that fear and respect were not mutually exclusive. People did not fear him because he might kill them, they feared him because he might outthink them, outmaneuver them, and leave them powerless without ever raising his voice. But success always attracts attention, and eventually, his name began to circulate among Soviet authorities as a figure worth watching. Investigators suspected that the scope of his activities was far greater than anything they had evidence for. This forced Semion to become even more careful, to expand his network in ways that allowed him to insulate himself from direct risk. If an operation was exposed, it was often a low-level associate who took the fall, leaving the man at the top untouched. This pattern would become a defining characteristic of his career and one of the reasons he would remain so difficult to prosecute in later years. These early ventures marked the beginning of a shift from small-time fraud to something much bigger, a transition from a clever hustler to a true criminal entrepreneur. The world outside was still changing, with the Soviet economy weakening year by year, creating more opportunities for those willing to bend the rules. For Mogilevich, this was the perfect environment to grow. He was ready to think beyond borders, beyond the reach of local police, and toward something international. As the 1980s approached, Semion Mogilevich stood at the edge of the next chapter of his life. He had tasted success, learned from prison, built a network, and proven to himself that he could outsmart both rivals and authorities. The question was no longer whether he could survive in this shadow economy. The question was how far he could go, and whether there was any limit at all. Soon, the fall of the Soviet Union would shake the world, and Mogilevich would be there, ready to seize opportunities on a scale no one had imagined. What happened next would not just expand his empire, it would make him a global figure, a name feared not just in Kiev but in London, New York, and beyond. The 1980s marked a decisive turning point for Semion Mogilevich. He was no longer the young man testing the waters of the black market, he had become a skilled navigator of its deepest currents. By now, he understood how to manipulate the weaknesses of the Soviet system with uncanny precision. Shortages were everywhere, from basic consumer goods to luxury items, and this created a hunger that Mogilevich was only too happy to satisfy. What began as small schemes with jewelry and currency soon expanded into large-scale fraud, smuggling, and organized operations that spanned multiple cities. If his early crimes had been the first sparks, the 1980s were when those sparks ignited into a full, roaring fire. One of Mogilevich's earliest large-scale operations involved art, religious relics, and antiques that were secretly taken out of the Soviet Union. The USSR was filled with priceless treasures, paintings, icons, and artifacts locked away in dusty museums or kept in private hands. Foreign collectors craved these items, and Semion saw the opportunity to connect that demand with a steady supply. With careful planning, he assembled teams that could source, transport, and sell these treasures abroad. The transactions were clever, often, items were declared as reproductions or worthless trinkets, allowing them to pass through customs unnoticed. Once they reached Western Europe or the United States, however, they were sold for staggering profits. Imagine the process, a network of scouts quietly seeking out valuable icons from rural churches, bribing caretakers to look the other way, and smuggling them out hidden in crates labeled as scrap material or machine parts. Somewhere across the border, another trusted contact would receive the shipment, clean and catalog the items, and arrange secretive auctions where wealthy buyers would compete to own a piece of forbidden Soviet history. Every step required coordination, trust, and the ability to make problems disappear before they became crises. Semion was the quiet architect of it all, pulling strings while staying far from the scenes of risk. But art was just one stream of income. As his reputation grew, Mogilevich moved into other lucrative areas, such as smuggling precious metals, oil, and even weapons. The Soviet Union was a place where almost anything could be had for the right price, if you knew the right people. Semion knew them all. He used his connections to buy goods at artificially low state prices, only to sell them abroad for hard currency. These were not petty operations, they involved trainloads of materials, forged paperwork, and entire chains of collaborators from factory managers to customs officers. Each successful operation strengthened his position and allowed him to expand. Soon, Mogilevich was no longer just a participant in these schemes, he was their organizer, their financier, and their ultimate beneficiary. He began structuring his operations like businesses, with layers of intermediaries shielding him from direct exposure. If one branch of the network was compromised, the others could continue without interruption. This ability to compartmentalize his empire would become one of his greatest strengths and one of the key reasons law enforcement struggled to pin him down for decades. And yet, even as he built this growing empire, Mogilevich maintained a remarkable ability to stay invisible. He was not flamboyant, not reckless. While other criminals flaunted their wealth, buying flashy cars and drawing attention, Semion preferred to invest his profits back into his network, buying influence, bribing the right officials, and expanding his reach. He understood that survival depended on discretion. To those who worked for him, this gave him an almost mythical aura. He was the man behind the curtain, the one who made things happen but rarely appeared in the open. Of course, not everyone was happy about his rise. In the underworld, success breeds envy, and rivals began to take notice of the quiet operator who seemed to be everywhere at once. There were conflicts, territorial disputes, betrayals, and the occasional disappearance of a competitor. But Mogilevich handled these challenges with his characteristic coolness. Violence was used sparingly and strategically, often through intermediaries, ensuring that his hands stayed clean. This approach minimized police attention and made it difficult for investigators to connect him directly to any bloodshed. By the mid-1980s, Mogilevich had transformed himself into something unique in the Soviet criminal landscape, a man who could bridge the gap between the brutal street gangs and the sophisticated financial world. He had contacts not only among smugglers and gangsters but also among businessmen, accountants, and corrupt officials. This allowed him to move seamlessly between the underworld and the legitimate economy, a skill that would prove invaluable in the years to come. What made this period particularly significant was that Mogilevich began to think internationally. While many Soviet criminals focused on domestic opportunities, Semion looked outward. He recognized that the real money was beyond the Soviet borders, in the markets of Europe and North America where goods sold for many times their Soviet value. He began building contacts abroad, setting up shell companies and bank accounts in foreign countries that could receive the profits from his operations. These steps were the blueprint for what would later become a truly global criminal empire. Picture the quiet nights when he sat with his trusted advisors, planning the next move, mapping out routes, discussing which commodities were most profitable and which borders were safest. These meetings were not the loud, chaotic gatherings of movie mobsters. They were quiet strategy sessions, more like boardroom discussions than criminal conspiracies. Each move was calculated, each risk weighed, and each success quietly celebrated. Semion was not just committing crimes, he was innovating, creating a model of organized crime that was less about muscle and more about intellect. The Soviet government, of course, continued to crack down on black market activity, but their efforts were often clumsy and reactive. When they closed one loophole, Semion would simply find another. If one smuggling route became too dangerous, he would shift to a different one. His ability to adapt was extraordinary, and it frustrated investigators who saw their targets vanish just as they closed in. By the late 1980s, Semion Mogilevich was no longer just a clever operator, he was a rising power, someone who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. He had built a reputation as a man who could make problems disappear and make money flow where it was needed most. And as the Soviet Union began to falter, as cracks appeared in the once unshakable structure of the communist state, Mogilevich was perfectly positioned to take advantage. The collapse of the USSR would create a vacuum, and into that vacuum would rush gangsters, oligarchs, and power brokers, but Semion was already there, waiting, with his network ready to expand on a scale no one had seen before. The fire he had lit in the 1980s was now blazing, and soon it would leap beyond Soviet borders, turning a clever black market hustler into one of the most formidable criminal masterminds in history. What came next would be the transformation of a man into a legend, and the quiet streets of Kiev and Moscow would no longer be big enough to contain him. His empire was about to go global, and the world was about to learn his name. The early 1990s were a time of chaos so complete that even history books struggled to capture the scale of it. The Soviet Union, which had once seemed like an unshakable fortress, crumbled almost overnight. In its place was a new Russia, confused, unstable, and full of opportunity for those bold enough to seize it. For ordinary citizens, it was a time of fear and hardship. For men like Semion Mogilevich, it was a golden age. The rules had been swept off the table, the watchdogs were distracted, and the state's treasures were suddenly up for grabs. If the 1980s were the training ground, the 1990s were the battlefield where Mogilevich would rise to power on a scale that defied imagination. Imagine the streets of Moscow and Kiev in those years, long lines of people clutching vouchers, waiting to trade them for scraps of ownership in newly privatized companies. These were supposed to represent fairness, a way for every citizen to share in the nation's wealth. But most people were hungry, desperate, and unprepared for the ruthless capitalism that had just arrived. Men with cash, men like Mogilevich, moved in to buy those vouchers for pennies on the ruble. Factories, oil fields, shipping companies, and entire industrial plants passed from state ownership into the hands of a few individuals almost overnight. This was the birth of the oligarchs, and though Mogilevich did not seek public fame like some of them, he was every bit as powerful in the shadows. Semion understood that real power was not in simply buying assets, but in controlling the flow of money and resources that moved through them. He began building a network that was part criminal syndicate, part multinational corporation. Shell companies were set up across Europe and beyond, bank accounts opened in Cyprus, the Caribbean, and Israel. Each one served as a node in a growing web of financial transactions that could wash dirty money clean and send it back into the world as legitimate profit. While others were looting warehouses and fighting in the streets, Mogilevich was orchestrating something far more sophisticated, the quiet transfer of wealth on a global scale. And it wasn't just about money. The collapse of the Soviet state also meant that its vast stockpiles of weapons and military equipment were suddenly vulnerable. Stories circulated of tanks, helicopters, and crates of assault rifles being sold to the highest bidder. While some of these tales were exaggerated, there was truth in the idea that powerful criminals and warlords were buying Soviet arms. Mogilevich, ever the strategist, was rumored to have been involved in facilitating some of these transfers, not necessarily by personally selling weapons, but by connecting buyers and sellers, arranging transport, and taking a cut of the profits. If a warlord in Africa or a militia in the Balkans wanted weapons, Mogilevich's network could make it happen. The 1990s also brought a flood of Russian organized crime into Europe and North America. The so-called Russian Mafia became a global brand, feared for its brutality and its reach. Semion's name began to surface in intelligence reports as a key figure in this wave, though he rarely left fingerprints that could tie him directly to violent crime. His specialty was finance, fraud, and laundering, and he was becoming so successful at it that billions of dollars were believed to pass through his network every year. The money came from many sources: oil scams, metals smuggling, drug trafficking, prostitution rings, and it flowed through banks in Hungary, Austria, and Switzerland before disappearing into complex offshore structures. Imagine the calm efficiency of it all. While the streets were filled with gang wars and car bombings, Mogilevich was sitting in a quiet office in Budapest, holding meetings that looked more like corporate board sessions than criminal summits. He dressed in conservative suits, preferred conversation to threats, and rarely raised his voice. But the men sitting across from him knew that he had the power to move millions with a word, and to destroy anyone who crossed him. This ability to project quiet authority made him one of the most respected and feared figures in the underworld. Of course, chaos attracts competition, and the newly free market was swarming with other criminals eager to claim their share. There were bloody power struggles as gangs fought over territory, rackets, and lucrative contracts. But Mogilevich kept himself above the fray. He formed alliances with groups like the Solnsevskaya Bratva, one of the most powerful mafia clans in Russia, ensuring that he had muscle when he needed it but never relying on brute force as his primary tool. This allowed him to expand with minimal conflict, focusing on the financial side of things while letting others handle enforcement. For the average person, these years were terrifying. Inflation was so high that life savings evaporated overnight. Pensions became worthless. Crime rates soared. But for Mogilevich, this instability was fuel. He thrived in the gaps left by a collapsing state, offering services, money movement, debt collection, protection, that the government could no longer provide. He was not just taking advantage of the chaos, he was becoming part of the new structure that replaced the old Soviet order. In a sense, he was helping to build the shadow economy that would run parallel to the official one for years to come. This was also the time when Mogilevich began to expand into Western markets in a major way. He invested in legitimate businesses, real estate, energy, even art galleries, that could serve as fronts for his laundering operations. His reach extended into the United States, where his schemes would eventually catch the attention of the FBI. But at this stage, most of the world still had no idea just how powerful he had become. To many, he was still just another name in the murky world of Russian organized crime. Only later would investigators realize that they were dealing with a man whose network rivaled that of entire cartels. As the 1990s moved forward, Mogilevich's empire became more sophisticated, more difficult to penetrate, and more ambitious in its goals. What he had built was no longer just a collection of smuggling routes and black market scams, it was a global machine capable of generating and cleaning billions. And yet, despite all this power, he remained largely invisible, a ghostly figure whose face was known to few outside law enforcement. This invisibility was his greatest shield, and he wielded it with mastery. But invisibility has its limits, and the scale of his operations was becoming too big to ignore. Western governments were starting to take notice. Bankers were filing suspicious activity reports, police agencies were sharing intelligence, and whispers about the Brainy Don were circulating in the corridors of power. The question was no longer whether Mogilevich would be discovered, but how long it would take before someone tried to bring him down. And so, as the decade drew to a close, Semion Mogilevich stood as one of the most powerful crime bosses in the world, rich, connected, and untouchable. The Soviet Union was gone, but in its place, he had built an empire that spanned continents. What came next would be a new phase of his story, the transformation of his operations into something even more corporate, more global, and more dangerous. The man who had once smuggled paintings was now playing with billions, and soon, the world would begin to understand just how far his shadow reached. By the early 1990s, Semion Mogilevich had reached a point where the scattered operations of his past were no longer enough. He was no longer a hustler, no longer just a smuggler moving goods under the table, he had become something bigger, something more refined. This was the period when he stepped fully into the role of an underworld architect, designing a structure that would turn his operations into a true criminal empire. If the collapse of the Soviet Union had opened the door, Mogilevich now walked through it with quiet confidence, setting up headquarters in one of the most strategically advantageous locations in Europe, Budapest, Hungary. Budapest in the 1990s was a city at a crossroads, caught between its communist past and its capitalist future. Its location in Central Europe made it an ideal hub for trade, travel, and, for men like Mogilevich, money laundering. The borders were more open, the banks were eager for foreign capital, and the authorities were still adjusting to the new reality of international business. It was the perfect environment for a man who needed to move money quietly and often. Semion established his base there, living in a respectable neighborhood and presenting himself not as a gangster, but as a businessman. To outsiders, he looked like a successful investor, polite, calm, dressed in tailored suits. But behind this facade, he was quietly orchestrating one of the most complex criminal enterprises of the modern age. His Budapest headquarters became the nerve center of an empire that stretched across continents. From there, he controlled a vast network of companies, some legitimate, others little more than shell entities that existed only on paper. These companies were registered in places like Cyprus, the Caribbean, and Liechtenstein, chosen carefully for their banking secrecy laws. Money from smuggling, fraud, and extortion would enter this network, disappear into layers of transactions, and emerge clean on the other side, ready to be invested in real estate, factories, or even the stock market. One of the crown jewels of his empire during this period was a company called YBM Magnex International, a magnet manufacturer that was publicly traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange. To the outside world, YBM looked like a legitimate, growing business. Its stock value soared, investors poured in money, and financial analysts praised its performance. But behind the scenes, authorities later discovered that YBM was being used to launder hundreds of millions of dollars of criminal proceeds. This was Mogilevich's genius at work, creating a legitimate front so convincing that it fooled not just regulators but some of the most sophisticated investors in North America. The Budapest years were also when Mogilevich cemented his alliances with some of the most powerful criminal organizations in Russia and Eastern Europe. The Solnsevskaya Bratva, often called the most powerful Russian mafia group, is said to have worked closely with him. This partnership provided muscle when needed, ensuring that debts were collected and competitors stayed in line, but it also gave Mogilevich access to an even wider network of contacts. Drugs, weapons, stolen goods, and even human trafficking routes were part of the larger picture. But Semion was not a man to get his hands dirty in day-to-day street-level operations. He stayed above it all, directing traffic like a conductor leading an orchestra, making sure each part of the machine moved in perfect synchrony. It is during this time that the image of Mogilevich as the Brainy Don became cemented in law enforcement circles. Unlike mob bosses in New York or Chicago, who were often seen at social clubs surrounded by soldiers, Mogilevich rarely appeared in public with bodyguards or entourages. He preferred to keep his profile low, relying on loyalty, bribery, and psychological leverage rather than constant displays of force. This made him harder to target. Even those who worked for him often only knew a fraction of what he was doing. The empire was structured like a pyramid, with Mogilevich at the very top and multiple layers of intermediaries separating him from the risky parts of the operation. There is something almost chilling about the calm efficiency with which he operated during these years. Meetings were held in quiet cafes or private offices, deals sealed with polite conversation rather than threats. Associates would later recall that he had an ability to put people at ease, to make even the most dangerous arrangements sound like ordinary business transactions. And yet, behind the politeness was an unmistakable aura of authority. Everyone knew that betrayal was not tolerated, that mistakes were costly, and that crossing Mogilevich could make a person vanish from the underworld entirely. The Budapest headquarters became more than just an office, it became a hub for intelligence. Information flowed in from all corners of his network, updates on shipping routes, bank transfers, political developments, even gossip about rival gangs. Mogilevich was not just moving money, he was gathering data, anticipating moves before they happened. This ability to see the bigger picture gave him an edge over competitors who were focused only on short-term profits. As his power grew, so did his connections to legitimate society. He was rumored to have contacts in governments, intelligence agencies, and police forces. Whether through bribery, favors, or mutual interest, these relationships allowed him to operate with a level of protection that few criminals could dream of. In many cases, when law enforcement agencies launched investigations, they found their efforts blocked by missing evidence, uncooperative witnesses, or legal complications. It was as though an invisible hand was guiding events to keep Mogilevich one step ahead. And yet, even in this position of strength, Mogilevich maintained his characteristic discretion. He did not seek fame or media attention. There were no lavish parties splashed across tabloids, no photographs of him flaunting wealth. His empire was built to be quiet, to be efficient, and to last. And for a time, it worked beautifully. Money flowed through his networks like water through hidden pipes, and his influence stretched from Moscow to Tel Aviv, from Budapest to New York. But power always has a price, and the very success that made Mogilevich a legend also began to attract more serious scrutiny. Western intelligence agencies were starting to piece together the scope of his activities. Journalists were digging into IBM Magnex, raising questions about its finances. And rival gangs, sensing the scale of what he controlled, were beginning to look for ways to cut themselves a bigger share. For now, though, Mogilevich remained untouchable, the ghost in the machine, quietly building an empire that seemed as solid as any legitimate corporation. This was the peak of his rise, the period when he seemed to hold all the cards. The man from Kiev who once smuggled paintings was now orchestrating billion-dollar operations from a European capital. But the bigger the empire, the greater the risk. Soon, the outside world would start to push back, and the calm order Mogilevich had built would be tested in ways that even he might not have fully anticipated. Money laundering was not just a tool for Semion Mogilevich, it was his art form, his masterpiece, the thing that set him apart from so many others who relied on guns and fear to get their way. By the mid-1990s, his empire had matured into a machine capable of cleaning vast rivers of dirty money, making billions appear as if they had come from legitimate business ventures. For most mobsters, laundering was an afterthought, a necessary evil to hide profits. For Mogilevich, it was the very heart of his operation, the place where all the threads came together. Imagine a spider's web stretched across continents, every strand a bank account, a corporation, a middleman. Money entered the web as cash from extortion, drug sales, arms deals, or fraud schemes. It traveled through a maze of transfers, investments, fake invoices, and offshore accounts before emerging on the other side as clean capital, ready to buy real estate, legitimate companies, or even stocks on public exchanges. The genius of Mogilevich's system was that it didn't just launder money, it made money. Each step in the process was designed to generate profit, so that the laundering itself became a business venture. One of his most ambitious creations was IBM Magnex International, the Canadian magnet company that became the jewel of his financial empire. On paper, IBM was a success story, a manufacturing company that produced industrial magnets, headquartered in Pennsylvania and publicly traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Investors saw a legitimate business with healthy revenue, glowing audits, and promising growth. But behind the scenes, IBM was a front, a vehicle to funnel hundreds of millions of dollars in criminal proceeds into the legitimate financial system. The scheme worked like this: Mogilevich's network would pump illicit money into IBM through fake contracts and overinflated sales. The company's financial statements would show booming profits, which drove up the stock price. Outside investors, eager to get in on a growing company, would buy shares, unknowingly mixing their money with funds from arms deals, smuggling operations, and other crimes. Then, at the right moment, insiders would quietly sell their shares for a massive profit. The laundering was complete. And everyone thought they were simply witnessing a successful business venture. What makes this story so striking is how bold it was. This was not back-alley laundering through shady casinos or suitcases full of cash. This was a public company, subject to audits, filings, and market analysis, and yet it managed to operate under the radar for years. It fooled not just small investors but major banks and regulators. There is something almost chilling about the image of Mogilevich sitting in a quiet office, watching stock tickers and balance sheets, knowing that every uptick on the chart represented money washed clean. Of course, IBM was only one piece of the puzzle. Mogilevich controlled an entire network of offshore companies that could be activated or dissolved at a moment's notice. Cyprus became one of his favorite playgrounds, thanks to its flexible corporate laws and banking secrecy. There, companies would be formed overnight, used to process transactions, and then quietly shut down once their purpose was complete. The same pattern repeated in Liechtenstein, Panama, and the Caribbean. These were not random choices, they were carefully selected jurisdictions with weak enforcement and strong privacy protections. Each layer of this financial architecture added protection. If investigators managed to trace money through one company, they would hit a dead end when it led to another offshore entity in a different country. By the time they pieced together the trail, the money had already moved again. It was like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. Even the FBI would later admit that Mogilevich's network was one of the most sophisticated they had ever encountered. And there was something almost serene about how he did it. While other mob bosses were known for temper tantrums and public displays of power, Mogilevich remained calm, patient, and methodical. He was playing a long game, one that required nerves of steel and an almost academic understanding of finance. He could wait months, even years, for the perfect moment to move money, to make a deal, to pull off the next big step. This patience made him far more dangerous than those who rushed for quick scores. But money laundering on this scale could not stay invisible forever. Whispers began to spread in financial circles. Journalists started asking questions about IBM's meteoric rise. Some investors noticed irregularities in the company's statements, shipments that didn't seem to match production capacity, partners who were hard to verify. Slowly, the spotlight began to turn toward Mogilevich and his network. When law enforcement finally moved in, they discovered just how massive the scheme had been. In 1998, Canadian and U.S. authorities raided IBM Magnex headquarters, seizing documents and freezing assets. The operation made headlines, and suddenly, the quiet businessman from Budapest was no longer just a rumor in intelligence reports, he was front-page news. The FBI named him as the man behind the operation and began calling him one of the most dangerous criminals in the world. For Mogilevich, this was a critical moment. The empire he had built was under scrutiny like never before, and yet, true to form, he managed to stay one step ahead. Despite years of investigation, he remained out of reach, protected by legal distance and layers of loyal associates who insulated him from direct charges. It was as though the entire machine had been built not just to make money, but to make Mogilevich untouchable. There is a strange, hypnotic quality to this chapter of his life. It is not filled with shootouts or explosions, it is filled with ledgers, contracts, and balance sheets, yet the stakes were just as high. Billions of dollars were in play, law enforcement agencies from multiple countries were involved, and still, the man at the center remained calm, smoking his cigarette, watching events unfold. It is this image, the quiet mastermind orchestrating a financial symphony, that gives Mogilevich's story its haunting power. And as YBM collapsed and authorities tried to recover stolen funds, Mogilevich was already looking forward, already moving money through new channels, already planning the next step. For him, laundering was not a single event, it was a living process, something that could adapt and survive as long as he kept thinking several moves ahead. The world now knew his name, but that did not mean they could catch him. In fact, the publicity only added to his legend, making him a ghostly figure who seemed to exist just beyond the reach of justice. And so, as the 1990s gave way to the 2000s, Semion Mogilevich was still in play, still in control, and still running one of the most complex financial empires the criminal world had ever seen. By the late 1990s, Semion Mogilevich was no longer just a crime boss, he had become a power broker, a figure whose influence stretched beyond the underworld and into the highest levels of politics, business, and even intelligence. His empire was no longer confined to smuggling routes and money laundering pipelines. It had become a global web, connecting oligarchs, gangsters, government officials, and legitimate corporations. To truly understand the power he wielded, one must picture this web not as a violent gang war but as a vast, invisible network of relationships, favors, and transactions that tied together some of the most powerful players on the planet. This was a period when Russia was reeling from economic collapse, defaulting on debt, and struggling to control its own resources. In this climate, organized crime groups became deeply intertwined with politics. Mogilevich, with his financial genius and his ability to keep things quiet, was perfectly positioned to act as a mediator between criminals and those in positions of authority. He was not the man kicking in doors or shooting rivals in alleys, he was the man who could pick up the phone and solve problems with a single call. If a shipment needed clearance, if a contract needed approval, if a rival needed to be pressured, Mogilevich knew exactly who to speak to and how much it would cost to make the problem go away. Reports from law enforcement and intelligence agencies later suggested that his network had contacts in multiple governments. Some speculated that he had ties to former KGB officers who had gone into private business after the Soviet collapse, bringing with them insider knowledge and connections. These relationships were mutually beneficial, Mogilevich gained protection and intelligence, while his contacts gained access to money and global reach. It is rumored that some of his companies were used to funnel money for state-connected operations, blurring the line between private criminal enterprise and covert political maneuvering. Imagine the quiet luxury of his meetings during this time. Not smoky bars or noisy gambling dens, but elegant restaurants, private dining rooms, and offices where deals were struck over fine wine and soft-spoken conversation. At the table might be an oligarch seeking help with offshore banking, a politician looking for campaign funds, or a businessman in need of muscle to push through a deal. Mogilevich was the quiet center of it all, offering solutions that were as profitable as they were discreet. His alliances with other criminal organizations were equally important. The Solnsevskaya Bratva remained one of his strongest partners, giving him access to one of the most powerful mafias in Russia. Together, they could coordinate operations that moved everything from heroin to weapons to human trafficking victims across borders with frightening efficiency. But Mogilevich also cultivated ties outside Russia, forming links with Italian organized crime, Israeli syndicates, and even Colombian drug cartels. This was not about ideology, it was about business. If there was money to be made, Mogilevich was willing to work with almost anyone. This global reach meant that his influence was felt in places far from Moscow or Budapest. Western Europe became a playground for his network, with front companies in London, Vienna, and Prague serving as waypoints for money and goods. In the United States, his financial tentacles extended into industries ranging from trucking to precious metals. At one point, American authorities even suspected that he had influence in gas and energy deals that affected entire regions. The sheer scale of these operations was staggering. Billions of dollars were believed to pass through his network each year, making him one of the wealthiest underworld figures in history. And yet, despite this, he maintained an aura of calm. He did not boast, he did not flaunt his power. In fact, those who met him often described him as polite, almost scholarly, with a quiet voice and a thoughtful manner. This made him even more dangerous. There was no bluster, no need to intimidate. His power spoke for itself, and everyone at the table knew it. Of course, with such a wide network came enemies and risks. Intelligence agencies began to worry that Mogilevich's operations were not just about making money but could also be used to destabilize economies or fund dangerous groups. There were allegations, never fully proven, that some of his arms trafficking deals may have involved supplying weapons to terrorist organizations. Whether these claims were true or exaggerated hardly mattered, they added to his mystique and to the growing perception that Mogilevich was not merely a criminal, but a man whose actions could ripple across continents. This was also the time when law enforcement agencies around the world began to take his threat more seriously. The FBI, Europol, and Interpol all placed him high on their lists of priority targets. But they faced a frustrating reality: every time they got close, every time they built a case, Mogilevich seemed to slip through their fingers. Witnesses vanished, documents went missing, or cases stalled in bureaucratic limbo. Some investigators even suspected that he had protection at levels so high that certain prosecutions were quietly shut down before they could gain traction. For listeners drifting into the rhythm of this story, this is the moment to pause and imagine just how surreal it must have felt for investigators. Here was a man they considered one of the most dangerous criminals alive, a man accused of laundering billions, defrauding investors, and arming violent factions, and yet he was living openly in Budapest, sometimes even giving interviews, seemingly unconcerned. It was as if he existed in a parallel world, one where ordinary laws did not apply. And yet, even Mogilevich must have known that this level of visibility could not last forever. The more his network grew, the harder it became to keep every piece under control. There were whispers of rival groups trying to encroach on his territory, of former allies turning into enemies, of political tides shifting in ways that could threaten his protection. The web he had spun was strong, but it was also stretched across a dangerous landscape, where one wrong move could cause the entire structure to tremble. Still, for now, Mogilevich remained at the top of his game. He was not merely a gangster but a strategist, a negotiator, and a financier with a global reach. His network was so vast and so well connected that some called him the boss of bosses, not because he commanded every criminal group, but because he was the one they all turned to when they needed a solution too complex for brute force. The stage was now set for the next chapter, a chapter that would bring more danger, more attention, and ultimately, the first serious cracks in Mogilevich's armor. The global web he had woven was about to be tested, and the world was about to watch as governments and law enforcement tried to catch the man who seemed untouchable. Power in the underworld is never uncontested. No matter how carefully Semion Mogilevich built his empire, no matter how quiet and calculated his approach, there were always rivals watching from the shadows, waiting for a chance to challenge him. The 1990s and early 2000s were a violent era for organized crime in Russia and Eastern Europe, a time of car bombs, assassinations, and bloody turf wars. Mogilevich's genius lay not in avoiding enemies, but in surviving them, outmaneuvering them, and ensuring that any threat to his empire was neutralized before it could grow into a real danger. Unlike the flamboyant gangsters of American cinema, Mogilevich never gloried in bloodshed. He understood that violence was bad for business, too loud, too messy, too likely to draw the attention of police and politicians he wanted to keep distracted. And yet, when force was necessary, it was delivered with chilling precision. Rivals who crossed him often found their operations quietly dismantled, their partners defecting, their sources of money drying up. Those who refused to back down sometimes vanished entirely, their fates whispered about in the corridors of the underworld but never written down. Imagine the quiet terror of being on the wrong side of Mogilevich. There were no shouting threats, no dramatic confrontations. Instead, a man might wake up one morning to find his bank accounts frozen, his partners refusing his calls, and his truck stopped at the border for random inspections. And then, just when he thought he could recover, an associate might turn up dead under mysterious circumstances, a message delivered without words. The effect was devastating, not just on the target but on everyone watching. It reminded them that Mogilevich might be calm, might be polite, but he was not to be crossed. His ties to the Solnsevskaya Bratva and other powerful mafia groups gave him access to enforcers who could act when diplomacy failed. These men were professionals, capable of eliminating threats with minimal collateral damage. To outsiders, it often seemed as if Mogilevich never got his hands dirty, and perhaps he didn't, but his enemies had a way of disappearing all the same. Law enforcement agencies suspected him of ordering multiple contract killings during this period, though proving his direct involvement was nearly impossible. The layers of intermediaries insulated him, and those who could testify against him often turned up missing or refused to speak. One of the most dangerous aspects of this period was the sheer volatility of the criminal landscape. Gangs were constantly forming, merging, and fighting for dominance. Territory was carved up like a chessboard, and alliances could shift overnight. A single deal gone wrong could ignite a war. Mogilevich's ability to keep his organization stable amid this chaos was a testament to his leadership. He acted less like a warlord and more like a statesman, forging agreements, brokering peace between factions, and ensuring that his business interests remained protected. But peace was never permanent. There were rumors of assassination attempts on Mogilevich himself, plots by rivals who saw him as too powerful, too influential. Some stories claim that he survived more than one attempt on his life during these years, though the details are shrouded in secrecy. If true, these incidents likely reinforced his commitment to staying in the background. The fewer public appearances he made, the safer he was. The violence was not limited to Russia and Eastern Europe. As his empire expanded globally, so did the risks. In Western Europe, competitors who tried to interfere with his operations sometimes met with sudden accidents. In Israel, where Mogilevich had significant business interests, law enforcement took notice of several suspicious deaths linked to money laundering operations. In the United States, the FBI grew increasingly concerned that his network was not just laundering money but also capable of influencing legitimate businesses through intimidation. And yet, for all the danger, Mogilevich's empire did not collapse under the weight of this conflict. If anything, it grew stronger. Each rival who was eliminated, each competitor who was forced out of the market, left more space for Mogilevich to expand. Fear, in this sense, became one of his most powerful tools. He did not need to use it often, just enough to remind the world that he was still there, still watching, still capable of decisive action. This period also revealed Mogilevich's talent for psychological warfare. He understood that sometimes the threat of violence was more effective than violence itself. A warning delivered through back channels, a hint that someone's name had been mentioned in the wrong circles, these subtle moves kept rivals off balance and prevented them from making bold plays against him. It was the criminal equivalent of a chess player sacrificing a pawn to protect the king, a move that forced opponents to think twice before attacking. For those loyal to him, Mogilevich could be surprisingly generous. He rewarded those who served him faithfully, ensuring that their families were cared for and that they shared in the profits of the empire. This created a strong inner circle, one less likely to betray him even under pressure. Law enforcement agencies often complained that witnesses were nearly impossible to flip when it came to Mogilevich's organization. Loyalty, whether born of respect or fear, kept the network tight. Of course, there were moments when the violence could not be hidden, when the scale of underworld conflicts spilled into public view. Car bombs in Moscow, assassinations in Budapest, shootouts in Kiev, these events sent shockwaves through the media and gave ordinary citizens a glimpse into the shadow war being fought around them. And while Mogilevich's name was not always mentioned in connection with these events, investigators often suspected that he was a silent beneficiary of the chaos, using it to strengthen his position while rivals weakened one another. For listeners drifting off to sleep, there is something haunting about this part of the story. It reminds us that power, even when wielded quietly, casts a long shadow. Mogilevich did not rule with a crown or a throne, but his decisions could determine who lived, who prospered, and who vanished without a trace. His empire was as much psychological as it was physical, built on a foundation of fear, respect, and absolute control. By the early 2000s, Mogilevich had survived a decade of rivalries, betrayals, and violent disputes, emerging stronger than ever. But this period also marked the beginning of a new challenge, the growing interest of Western governments and law enforcement agencies who were now determined to bring him down. The quiet wars of the underworld were about to give way to a more public confrontation, one that would see Mogilevich placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list and hunted across continents. Behind the legend of Semion Mogilevich, behind the headlines that called him the most dangerous man alive, there was still a man, a father, a husband, a figure who enjoyed quiet evenings, fine food, and private conversation. To truly understand him, we must step away from the spreadsheets, the smuggling routes, and the whispers of assassinations, and look at the human being who stood at the center of this global web. It is here, in the quieter moments, that we see the paradox that made Mogilevich so fascinating, a man who could orchestrate billion-dollar frauds with ice-cold precision and yet live with a calmness that felt almost domestic. In Budapest, where he made his home during much of the 1990s, neighbors often described him not as a fearsome gangster but as a polite, soft-spoken man who carried himself with the air of a respectable businessman. He was not the type to roar down the street in sports cars or host loud parties. His tastes, though expensive, were understated. He dined in fine restaurants but preferred private rooms. He wore tailored suits but nothing gaudy. Even his home life was marked by a kind of quiet order. For a man with such a dangerous reputation, Mogilevich lived with surprising normalcy, as if he wanted the outside world to forget that he was there at all. Those close to him said he had a dry, clever sense of humor, often making jokes in a low voice that only a few people caught. He read widely and was known to discuss literature, politics, and economics with the same calm interest he applied to his business dealings. There was a depth to him that went beyond crime, a sense that he was a thinker as much as a doer. Some even compared him to a chess master, always considering the long-term consequences of every move, not just on the board of the underworld but in his personal life as well. But there was also another side to him, a fiercely protective one when it came to his family. Mogilevich reportedly had children and worked to shield them from the chaos of his business world. Friends say that he kept family and business separate whenever possible, insisting that his loved ones live as normally as they could. In a world filled with betrayal and violence, this dedication to those closest to him added another layer of complexity to his character. He could be ruthless to rivals but generous and even tender to those within his inner circle. Imagine him in the evening, sitting in a warm apartment in Budapest, a glass of wine in hand, discussing the day with trusted associates while his family sleeps safely in another room. The phone calls he took might have involved millions of dollars, entire shipping routes, or political favors that could shift markets, and yet, when the conversation ended, he would return to the quiet of the room, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. This ability to separate the chaos of his empire from the calmness of his private life may have been one of the reasons he survived so long. This period of relative calm also gave Mogilevich time to reflect and consolidate power. While rivals were tearing each other apart in bloody street wars, he was building something more permanent, something designed to last for decades rather than months. This patience was part of his personality. He was not impulsive, not prone to rash decisions. Even his enemies admitted that Mogilevich thought things through carefully, weighing risks and rewards before acting. This meant that when he did make a move, it was almost always decisive and effective. But his calm exterior should not be mistaken for softness. Those who knew him well said that his temper, when provoked, could be frightening, not loud, but cold. It was not the kind of anger that erupted in shouting matches. It was the kind that arrived silently, in the form of quiet decisions made behind closed doors, decisions that could change a person's fate forever. This, perhaps more than anything, is what made him so feared, his ability to strike without warning, without spectacle, and without leaving a trace. There were rumors, of course, about how he lived when no one was watching. Some said he had secret villas across Europe, that he collected fine art, that he kept vaults filled with gold and cash as a hedge against disaster. Whether these stories were true or exaggerated, they added to the myth of Mogilevich as a man who always had a contingency plan, who was never caught unprepared. And yet, through all of this, there was something strangely human about him. He was not a movie villain cackling in the dark, but a man who seemed to enjoy conversation, good food, and the company of trusted friends. Perhaps this is what makes his story so haunting, the reminder that some of the most dangerous people in the world are not monsters but men who could pass unnoticed in a crowd, who could sit next to you in a cafe and seem perfectly ordinary. This glimpse behind the mask does not excuse what Mogilevich did, but it does help us understand the man he was. He was both criminal and caretaker, both strategist and family man, both ghost and flesh and blood human. And as the 2000s approached, this balance between public invisibility and private stability would soon be disrupted. The quiet life he had built in Budapest would be shaken by growing attention from law enforcement, from journalists, and from governments determined to bring him down. The man who had managed to stay in the shadows for so long was about to face a new kind of threat, one that could not be solved with bribes, one that could not simply be outmaneuvered. The calm before the storm was coming to an end, and soon, the world would watch as Semion Mogilevich was placed in the crosshairs of some of the most powerful law enforcement agencies on Earth. By the dawn of the new millennium, Semion Mogilevich's name was no longer just a whispered rumor in the corridors of intelligence agencies, it had become a top priority for some of the most powerful law enforcement organizations in the world. The IBM Magnex scandal had blown the quiet cover he had maintained for years. What had once looked like a legitimate business success story was now exposed as one of the most sophisticated money laundering operations ever uncovered on North American soil. The raid on IBM's Pennsylvania headquarters in 1998 had sent shockwaves through the financial world, and investigators were stunned by the scale of the fraud. For the first time, Mogilevich's empire had been dragged into the light. Imagine the FBI's war rooms during those days. Maps of Europe pinned with red markers, stacks of wire reports, spreadsheets showing money trails crossing borders, and photos of Mogilevich pinned at the center of the board like the eye of a storm. The agents tasked with finding him knew they were not chasing an ordinary criminal. He was not a mobster who could be cornered with a wiretap or taken down with a drug bust. He was a financial mastermind whose transactions crossed multiple jurisdictions, each one more complicated than the last. The charges against him were serious: racketeering, securities fraud, wire fraud, mail fraud, and money laundering, all tied to the IBM case. The amount of money involved was staggering. Hundreds of millions of dollars had been siphoned from investors. Some reports suggested that as much as $150 million had been stolen in the scheme, making it one of the largest stock fraud cases in history at the time. And yet, despite the mountain of evidence, Mogilevich himself was nowhere to be found. Law enforcement agencies in Canada, the United States, and Europe began coordinating their efforts. Interpol issued notices, hoping to limit his ability to travel. The FBI placed him on its 10 most wanted fugitives list, putting him in the company of terrorists, cartel leaders, and violent fugitives. The description on the FBI's wanted poster painted him as a quiet but extremely dangerous man, warning that his criminal network spanned continents and was capable of infiltrating legitimate industries. His photograph, a round-faced man with calm, unreadable eyes, became one of the most recognizable in international law enforcement. But Mogilevich was not a man who panicked. As pressure mounted, he simply disappeared from public view, retreating deeper into Russia and the protective sphere it offered him. He was careful, using safe houses, private communication networks, and loyal associates to maintain control of his empire from a distance. For investigators, it was maddening. Every time they thought they had a lead, it went cold. Witnesses were hard to find, and those who did talk often recanted or became unavailable. This manhunt quickly turned into a cat-and-mouse game that spanned years. Agents traveled to Europe, meeting with intelligence counterparts, piecing together sightings, following financial leads. They knew Mogilevich was out there, living comfortably somewhere, but his exact location remained elusive. It was as though he had mastered the art of being present and absent at the same time, conducting business, maintaining connections, and yet staying just out of reach of those who wanted to arrest him. The tension was not just about the crimes already committed. There was growing concern about what Mogilevich might do next. Intelligence reports suggested that his network was still active, still moving billions through offshore banks, still connected to arms deals and smuggling routes. Some feared that his financial networks could be exploited by terrorist organizations or rogue states to move funds secretly. This elevated him from a criminal target to a potential national security threat. The image of Mogilevich began to shift in the public imagination. Journalists wrote profiles describing him as the Brainy Don and the most dangerous man you've never heard of. He became a figure of dark fascination, the kind of criminal mastermind that sounded like something from a spy novel. People were intrigued by the idea of a man who could run such a vast empire without firing a shot, who could stay invisible even while being hunted by the world's most powerful police agencies. And still, Mogilevich seemed almost untouchable. Part of this untouchability came from where he had chosen to hide. Russia, with its complex relationship with the West and its unwillingness to extradite its own citizens, offered him a shield that even the FBI could not easily pierce. As long as he stayed within Russian borders, he was relatively safe from arrest. Some even speculated that he had friends in high places, people with enough influence to warn him of raids or protect him from legal trouble. This period of open pursuit only added to his legend. There was something both frustrating and awe-inspiring about a man who could remain free while being one of the most wanted fugitives on the planet. Law enforcement agencies held press conferences, released updates, and encouraged the public to come forward with tips. But tips rarely led anywhere useful. It was as though Mogilevich had become a ghost, his movements known only to those inside his trusted circle. For Mogilevich himself, this was likely both a challenge and a point of pride. He had spent his life building a network designed to shield him from exactly this scenario, and now that network was being put to the ultimate test. That he remained free was proof that his design worked. And so, while the FBI hunted him across continents, Semion Mogilevich continued to live his life, quietly, carefully, but still very much in control. This chapter of the story is where the stakes feel highest. The hunter and the hunted are now fully engaged, each trying to outthink the other. The FBI had the resources of the U.S. government, international partners, and a growing mountain of evidence. Mogilevich had his intelligence, his network, and the protection of a state that seemed unwilling to let him go. The result was a standoff that would drag on for years, a slow-burn thriller in which every move mattered and every silence was significant. For those listening now, the image is almost cinematic, agents poring over files late into the night, financial analysts tracing wire transfers, field operatives knocking on doors across Europe, all while somewhere in Moscow, a man sits in a quiet apartment, sipping tea, calmly directing an empire that refuses to die. It is a reminder that power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it hides in plain sight, confident that it cannot be caught. The manhunt for Semion Mogilevich had become more than just a criminal investigation, it was an international chess match, with governments, intelligence agencies, and law enforcement on one side, and a quiet, calculating mastermind on the other. Each move seemed to be anticipated, each trap avoided, as though Mogilevich could see the entire board several moves ahead. For the agents pursuing him, it was maddening. For Mogilevich, it was simply business as usual. After the YBM Magnex scandal broke and the FBI placed him on its 10 most wanted list, the pressure on Mogilevich was immense. Interpol notices were issued, bank accounts were flagged, and cooperating countries were urged to arrest him if he crossed their borders. In theory, this should have made travel impossible. In practice, Mogilevich's network turned the world into a labyrinth of safe passageways and hidden doors. He used false names, safe houses, and trusted couriers to move information and money without exposing himself. Imagine the scene: an airport security officer in Vienna scans passenger manifests while an FBI liaison sits nearby, waiting for a sighting. Somewhere not far away, in a different city altogether, Mogilevich boards a private flight under an assumed identity, his travel plans known only to a handful of trusted aides. By the time anyone realizes where he might have been, he is already gone, leaving behind nothing but faint traces, a receipt here, a rumor there, never enough to make an arrest. His ability to avoid capture was not just about hiding, it was about anticipation. Sources later suggested that Mogilevich had people inside key institutions, not necessarily spies in the dramatic sense, but contacts who would warn him when law enforcement pressure was building. A quiet word from a bank employee, a discreet phone call from a sympathetic official, and Mogilevich would shift his operations, moving funds, closing companies, or leaving town just ahead of a raid. It was as if he was always listening, always aware of where the danger was coming from. The FBI, Europol, and their counterparts were forced to think creatively. They attempted coordinated operations, hoping to catch him off guard. There were raids in multiple cities, joint task forces formed to share intelligence, and surveillance operations that ran for months. Each time, they came close but never quite close enough. Witnesses who could have tied Mogilevich to crimes were either too afraid to speak or vanished mysteriously before trial. Others were compromised, offering only half-truths that led investigators down false trails. One particularly frustrating pattern emerged during these years: whenever law enforcement thought they had pinned Mogilevich down, he would suddenly appear in a place where he was untouchable. Russia, with its strict stance against extraditing its own citizens, became his ultimate sanctuary. If pressure mounted in one part of the world, Mogilevich could simply retreat to Moscow, where he reportedly lived under his own name, sometimes even giving interviews. The sight of him calmly speaking to journalists while remaining out of reach of the FBI was infuriating to those chasing him. There is a strange stillness to this part of the story. The violence of the earlier years gives way to a quiet, tense game of moves and countermoves. Picture agents sitting in darkened rooms late at night, going over flight records, bank transfers, and intercepted phone calls, trying to piece together a pattern. Each new piece of data feels like a breakthrough, until Mogilevich changes the game again, rendering the intelligence obsolete. The frustration builds like a slow, steady drumbeat, but still, they cannot stop. And all the while, Mogilevich's network continues to function. Money keeps moving, businesses keep operating, and associates keep reporting back to him. The empire does not sleep, even as its architect becomes harder and harder to see. Those who worked with him during this period said he was calm, even amused by the hunt. He seemed to enjoy outthinking his pursuers, treating it as another challenge to be solved, another problem to be managed with the same patience he applied to every part of his life. But this game was not without risks. Each close call put new pressure on Mogilevich's organization. Trusted allies had to be rotated, safe houses had to be abandoned, and old methods of communication replaced with new ones. There were rumors that some of his associates were caught or flipped during this time, providing law enforcement with valuable information. This forced Mogilevich to adapt, tightening his circle and relying on fewer people, which made the empire more secure but also more fragile. For those listening, this is the part of the story where suspense runs high. The idea of a man evading some of the most powerful agencies in the world for years on end is both fascinating and unsettling. It challenges the notion that justice is inevitable, reminding us that power can sometimes shield a person so effectively that even the combined efforts of multiple nations cannot break through. And yet, even in this high-stakes chase, Mogilevich never seemed reckless. He did not flee blindly or burn through resources in desperation. Instead, he moved with the same measured patience that had brought him this far. If he had to disappear, he did so completely, waiting months or even years before resurfacing. If he had to fight a legal battle, he used the best lawyers money could buy, dragging cases out until prosecutors were forced to drop them or accept reduced charges. This period became almost legendary in law enforcement circles. Agents who worked the case would speak of Mogilevich with a mix of frustration and respect, calling him one of the most intelligent and elusive targets they had ever pursued. Some even admitted that chasing him became an obsession, a puzzle they couldn't stop trying to solve. Eventually, the world's attention began to shift. New threats emerged: terrorism, cybercrime, other global cartels, and resources were spread thin. Mogilevich, always attuned to the larger picture, seemed to sense this shift. Slowly, carefully, he began to reappear in more public settings, moving with the confidence of a man who knew that, for now, the hunt had cooled. But this was not the end of the game. The law had not forgotten him, and his name remained on wanted lists, his file still open on desks in Washington, Ottawa, and The Hague. The chess match was not over, it had simply moved into a quieter phase. Mogilevich had survived yet again, proving that he was more than just a criminal. He was a strategist, a ghost, a man who could slip between the cracks of the world's most powerful systems and come out untouched. The winter of 2008 brought a moment that many had been waiting for, and yet few truly believed would ever happen. After years of evading capture, of outsmarting investigators, and of moving like a ghost through the shadows, Semion Mogilevich was finally arrested, and it happened not in a foreign country, not in some daring cross-border sting, but in Moscow, the very city that had so often been his refuge. For a man who had seemed untouchable for so long, the news was nothing short of sensational. Picture the gray Moscow sky that morning, the streets slick with ice, the city wrapped in a biting cold. Somewhere in the capital, police vehicles gathered quietly, their engines humming in the frigid air. The arrest was carried out by Russian authorities, and though the official charges were for tax evasion, a far cry from the billions in fraud and international laundering he was accused of abroad, the message was clear: even Mogilevich could be reached. Witnesses say the arrest was surprisingly calm. There were no shootouts, no desperate attempts to escape. Semion, true to his nature, reportedly did not resist. He was taken into custody with the same quiet composure that had always defined him, as though he had anticipated this day and had already accepted it as just another move in a long game. To the outside world, the image was striking: the man called the most dangerous mobster alive, being led away in handcuffs by Russian police, his face expressionless, his demeanor almost serene. News of the arrest spread quickly, and with it came a wave of shock and speculation. In boardrooms, in government offices, and in the criminal underworld, people wondered what it meant. Was Russia finally turning on one of its most infamous figures? Was this part of a larger crackdown on organized crime, or merely a symbolic gesture? And perhaps most importantly, would Mogilevich stay in prison long enough for foreign governments to request his extradition? Inside his network, the reaction was immediate. Associates scrambled to secure assets, to protect ongoing operations, to prepare for the possibility that law enforcement might now have access to sensitive information. There was fear, real fear, that with Mogilevich behind bars, rivals might make their move, that competitors might try to seize control of lucrative routes and operations. The empire he had built over decades seemed to tremble, its foundations suddenly uncertain. But those who knew Mogilevich personally remained calm. They had seen him survive worse. They believed that this was not the end but merely another chapter. His influence, after all, did not vanish just because he was in a cell. He still had allies, he still had money, and he still had leverage. If anyone could turn an arrest into just a temporary inconvenience, it was Semion Mogilevich. For investigators around the world, the arrest was a moment of both triumph and frustration. On the one hand, the man they had hunted for so long was finally in custody. On the other, the charges were narrowly focused, tax evasion related to a company inside Russia, and there was no immediate indication that he would be handed over to foreign authorities. The FBI issued statements reaffirming that he remained one of their top targets and that they would pursue every legal avenue to bring him to the United States to face justice. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the legal process unfolded slowly. Russian courts are famously opaque, and details about the case were scarce. What was clear was that Mogilevich was being held at the infamous Matryoshkaya Tishina detention center, a stark facility known for housing some of Russia's most notorious prisoners. For months, he remained there, and speculation grew about whether he was negotiating behind the scenes, using his connections to secure a release. Imagine those months from Mogilevich's perspective. The man who had always been free to move, to plan, to direct his empire now confined to a cell, his world reduced to concrete walls and narrow windows. And yet, those who monitored the case said he never seemed rattled. He received visitors, consulted lawyers, and, according to some reports, continued to manage parts of his operations even from prison, passing messages through loyal intermediaries. The media followed the story closely, each court appearance turning into a small spectacle. Photographs of Mogilevich being led into the courtroom circulated widely, his expression unreadable, as though he were simply waiting for the next move in a game he still believed he could win. Then, in 2009, almost as suddenly as he had been arrested, Semion Mogilevich was released. Russian authorities announced that the charges against him had been dropped, citing lack of evidence. To outsiders, it seemed almost unbelievable, after all the effort that had gone into bringing him in, after the months of detention, he was simply allowed to walk free. For his critics, this was proof of what they had always suspected, that Mogilevich was too well connected, too well protected to be kept in custody for long. His release sent a clear signal to both his allies and his enemies: Mogilevich was back, and he was still a force to be reckoned with. Within his network, relief swept through like a quiet wind. Operations that had been paused resumed, and the empire that had trembled began to steady itself once more. The man who had been called untouchable had proven, yet again, that even an arrest could not hold him for long. But something had changed. The arrest had reminded everyone, Mogilevich included, that he was not invincible. It had shown that even in Moscow, even with powerful friends, there were moments when the system could turn against him. This realization would shape the next phase of his life. He would become even more cautious, even more selective about where he appeared and how he operated. The ghost would retreat further into the shadows, harder to see, harder to reach, but still very much alive. For those listening, this chapter is a reminder that even legends can be shaken, that even the most carefully built empires can feel the ground shift beneath them. And yet, it is also a testament to Mogilevich's resilience, his ability to weather storms that would have destroyed lesser men. The arrest that was supposed to mark his downfall became, instead, just another test that he passed, another story that added to his myth. And so, as he stepped out of detention in 2009, Semion Mogilevich was once again free, perhaps more cautious, perhaps more watchful, but still in control. The empire had survived, but the game had changed. The world was watching him more closely than ever, and every move he made from this point forward would have to be more careful, more deliberate. When the heavy prison doors of Matryoshkaya Tishina finally opened in 2009 and Semion Mogilevich stepped back into the Moscow air, it was not with fanfare or triumph. There were no reporters waiting to shout questions, no dramatic press conference to mark the occasion. His release was quiet, almost anticlimactic, as though the entire ordeal had been a bad dream that the state was eager to forget. For Mogilevich, this quiet was exactly what he wanted. After months in detention and the world's eyes fixed firmly on him, he had no intention of returning to the public stage. Instead, he retreated, not in defeat, but in deliberate, strategic silence. It was a silence that spoke volumes. To those in his network, it signaled that the boss was back in control, that patience would be rewarded, and that operations could resume, albeit with greater caution than ever before. The months following his release were a period of careful recalibration. Mogilevich understood that the world had changed during his time in custody. The global financial system was now under tighter scrutiny, thanks in part to the 2008 economic crisis. Governments were watching money flows more closely, tracking offshore accounts, and cooperating more than ever to combat organized crime. If his empire was to survive, it would need to adapt. And so, piece by piece, Mogilevich began to reorganize. Old shell companies that had become liabilities were dissolved, replaced with new entities registered in even more secretive jurisdictions. Trusted lieutenants were shuffled, some retired quietly with generous payouts, others promoted into new positions of responsibility. Layers of intermediaries were added, creating even greater distance between Mogilevich and the daily operations of his businesses. The result was an empire that was leaner, more efficient, and even harder to penetrate than before. Those close to him said he became even more selective about the people he dealt with personally. Meetings were rare, conducted in private apartments or quiet restaurants, often without any electronics present to avoid surveillance. Communication was increasingly handled through intermediaries, and even they often knew only fragments of the whole picture. Mogilevich had always been cautious, but now he seemed almost ghostly, present everywhere and nowhere at once. This was also a time when Mogilevich is believed to have focused heavily on protecting his wealth. Reports suggested that he moved significant portions of his fortune into real estate, art, and hard assets that were difficult to trace and could not be easily frozen by foreign governments. Some investigators speculated that he used this period to set up a kind of war chest, ensuring that he and his family would be financially secure no matter what happened next. Whether these stories are true or exaggerated, they add to the sense that Mogilevich was not just reacting to events, he was planning for the long game, preparing for whatever storms the future might bring. Despite his low profile, whispers of his influence continued to circulate. Law enforcement agencies in Europe and North America still considered him a top target, and intelligence reports suggested that his network remained active in energy deals, metals trading, and other lucrative sectors. Some claimed that his reach extended into legitimate politics, with allies who held positions of real power. These rumors, whether factual or not, reinforced his reputation as a man whose influence could not be measured simply by the number of crimes attributed to him. For the criminal underworld, his release and quiet return were a reminder that Mogilevich was still the boss of bosses, still the man whose approval could make or break a deal. Rival groups that had eyed his territory during his imprisonment thought twice before making a move. If anything, his short stint in detention seemed to have strengthened his legend, proving that even when brought down, he could rise again, untouched and unbroken. There was, however, a subtle shift in his approach. Gone was the need to expand aggressively or to take risks that might expose him. Instead, Mogilevich seemed content to consolidate what he had, to protect rather than to conquer. The empire no longer needed to grow at a breakneck pace, it needed to endure. He had already reached heights few criminals ever attained. Now, it was about legacy, about ensuring that what he had built would last beyond him, that the network would outlive its architect. Imagine him during these years, sitting in a quiet room in Moscow, cigarette smoke curling lazily toward the ceiling, speaking softly to a handful of trusted men. The conversations were likely about restructuring, about ensuring loyalty, about choosing which ventures to keep and which to abandon. There is a stillness to this image, a sense that Mogilevich had moved past the feverish ambition of his earlier years and into a stage of careful stewardship. And yet, even in this quieter phase, danger remained. There were still enemies, still law enforcement agencies gathering intelligence, still journalists determined to write his story. Each day of freedom was another gamble, another day when things could go wrong. But Mogilevich was a man who thrived under pressure. If anything, these threats only made him more focused, more deliberate. For listeners, this chapter feels like the deep breath before another storm, a moment of calm reflection where the man at the center of the story sharpens his tools and strengthens his defenses. It is a reminder that survival, in the criminal world, is not just about force but about patience, planning, and the ability to disappear when necessary. By the time the second decade of the 2000s arrived, Mogilevich had once again faded from the headlines, but his name still hovered in the background of intelligence reports and organized crime briefings. He was no longer the man being paraded in handcuffs for the cameras, he was back to being the ghost, the figure whose presence could be felt but rarely seen. When news broke that Semion Mogilevich had been quietly released from Russian custody in 2009, the reaction outside Russia was immediate and intense. In Washington, Ottawa, and Brussels, officials who had spent years tracking his network were stunned. This was the man they had called the most dangerous criminal in the world, a man tied to massive financial fraud, money laundering, and alleged arms trafficking, and now he was free, living openly once again. The sense of frustration was palpable. To many in the West, his release was not just a legal decision but a message. Moscow was not going to hand over one of its most notorious citizens, no matter how loud the outcry. Governments quickly began to act. The United States reaffirmed Mogilevich's place on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, keeping his face on posters and his name circulating in press briefings. Sanctions were quietly discussed, aimed at freezing any assets that could be tied to him or his companies. The Treasury Department placed some of his known shell companies under scrutiny, making it more difficult for them to operate through U.S. banks. Canada and several European countries tightened their financial oversight, putting pressure on banks in Cyprus and other offshore havens to report suspicious transactions that might be connected to his network. But even with these efforts, there was an underlying sense of helplessness. Mogilevich remained in Russia, where extradition was out of the question, and appeared to be living freely. Some reports suggested that he could be seen dining at restaurants, attending cultural events, and even giving interviews. The paradox was striking, one of the world's most wanted men, and yet no one could touch him. The media, sensing a compelling story, began to dig deeper. Major newspapers published exposés on his operations, outlining the vast reach of his network and the ways it had allegedly infiltrated legitimate industries. Documentaries were made, tracing his rise from the streets of Kiev to the boardrooms of Budapest. Television hosts debated how a man with such a reputation could evade justice for so long. To the public, he became almost mythic, a symbol of the power of organized crime and the limitations of international law. Each article, each news report seemed to feed the legend. They painted a portrait of a man who had outwitted not just rival criminals but entire governments, a man who had built an empire so complex that it could not be dismantled by force alone. Some even suggested that he had become too important to arrest, that his connections were so deeply woven into political and economic systems that taking him down would have unintended consequences. Whether or not this was true, it added to the aura of untouchability that surrounded him. For financial watchdogs and anti-corruption groups, Mogilevich's release became a rallying point. Reports were published calling for greater transparency in global banking, for closing the loopholes that allowed billions of dollars to vanish into shell companies. Law enforcement agencies held conferences discussing how to better cooperate across borders. Mogilevich's name was often mentioned as the ultimate example of why international cooperation was necessary, because men like him could exploit every gap in the system. Meanwhile, in the criminal underworld, his return to freedom had its own ripple effects. Rivals who had quietly expanded during his absence now had to reconsider their positions. Allies who had stayed loyal were rewarded, their loyalty reinforced by the fact that Mogilevich was back in control. The balance of power shifted once more, subtly but decisively, in his favor. His empire, though bruised by the arrest, seemed not only intact but perhaps stronger, now leaner and more disciplined. What made this period so fascinating was the contrast between perception and reality. To the public, Mogilevich was a figure of intrigue, a headline, a face on a wanted poster. To those inside his circle, he was still the boss, still giving orders, still making decisions, still pulling strings. The sanctions, the media coverage, the pressure from abroad, all of it may have complicated his operations, but it did not stop them. If anything, it forced him to become even more creative, finding new ways to move money and maintain influence. And yet, there was an undeniable shift. Mogilevich seemed to step back from overtly ambitious projects, focusing instead on consolidating what he already controlled. There were fewer high-risk ventures, fewer moves that might attract unnecessary attention. He had survived arrest and release, but he knew the world was watching. This was a time for subtlety, for reinforcing the walls of his empire rather than expanding them recklessly. The public fascination with him continued to grow. Crime writers included him in books about global mafias, and investigative journalists kept uncovering new threads of his operations. Every revelation seemed to deepen the mystery. How much money did he truly control? How many companies were tied to him? How far did his influence reach? The answers were elusive, and perhaps that was the point. The less that was known, the more the myth grew. For listeners drifting into the quiet rhythm of this story, this chapter feels like the eye of a storm, a moment when the world has recognized the size of the force it is facing, but cannot yet do anything to stop it. Governments have reacted, laws have been tightened, the spotlight has been turned on, but the man at the center remains calm, seated somewhere in Moscow, watching it all unfold. The stage was set for the next act, one that would focus not just on the world's reaction but on the enduring mystery of Mogilevich's fortune. Where was all the money hidden? How much had he managed to protect from seizure? And would anyone ever truly know the full scope of what he had built? There is something almost mythical about the question of Semion Mogilevich's wealth. No one, not investigators, not journalists, not even some of his closest associates, has ever been able to put an exact number on how much money the man actually controlled. Estimates range from hundreds of millions to several billions, scattered across the globe like pieces of a puzzle no one has ever managed to solve. And perhaps that is exactly how Mogilevich wanted it. In the world of high-level organized crime, power often lies in uncertainty, in making sure that no one ever truly knows the full extent of what you own, or what you are capable of. Investigators over the years have followed countless trails, each one leading to a different corner of the financial world. There were bank accounts in Cyprus, companies registered in the British Virgin Islands, real estate holdings in London and Tel Aviv, and rumors of investments in oil and gas projects stretching from Russia to Eastern Europe. Each discovery seemed to raise more questions than it answered. For every account that was frozen, another would appear somewhere else. For every company that was shut down, two new ones would quietly spring up in another jurisdiction, registered under new names but ultimately tied to the same invisible hand. Imagine vaults in anonymous banks, their contents known only to a select few, or safety deposit boxes in Zurich filled with bearer bonds, gold bars, or rare art. These are the images that come to mind when one thinks about Mogilevich's fortune. He was said to be particularly fond of using tangible assets as a store of wealth, things that could not be erased by a frozen account or a cancelled wire transfer. Some journalists reported that he had quietly amassed a collection of rare paintings, icons, and sculptures, storing them in secret locations across Europe. To this day, no one knows for certain what treasures he may have hidden away. There were also whispers of stakes in legitimate businesses. Unlike some gangsters who kept their money separate from the world of legal commerce, Mogilevich seemed to understand that legitimacy was the ultimate shield. Owning shares in factories, energy companies, and shipping firms not only provided a steady stream of income but also offered a layer of protection. These were entities too large, too politically connected, to simply shut down. It was said that some of these businesses operated at a profit entirely independent of criminal activity, meaning that even if every illegal operation was dismantled, Mogilevich would still be wealthy. For financial investigators, this was the most frustrating part. They could identify the patterns, the money flows, even some of the beneficiaries, but the total picture always remained out of reach. It was like chasing smoke through a maze. Each time they thought they had cornered the fortune, it would shift, reroute, vanish into a new shell corporation or a new jurisdiction. Mogilevich was not just laundering money, he was creating a financial ecosystem that could survive on its own, a system designed to outlast any single investigation. There is a strange poetry to this mystery. The idea that somewhere out there, hidden in bank ledgers and private vaults, lies a fortune so vast that it could rival the GDP of a small country. It is a fortune that no one has ever fully seen, one that exists as both fact and legend. And this, perhaps, is what gives Mogilevich his enduring aura, the knowledge that even today, long after his name first made headlines, there are billions in the shadows tied to his name. Even those who worked with him often admitted they did not know the full scope of his resources. Mogilevich was careful to compartmentalize knowledge, ensuring that no one person had access to every piece of the puzzle. A trusted lieutenant might know about one cluster of accounts, one real estate portfolio, or one network of companies, but never the whole map. This meant that betrayal was less dangerous and that even under pressure, no single defection could bring down the empire. For ordinary people reading about this mystery, there is an almost hypnotic quality to imagining such hidden wealth. We picture secret rooms stacked with cash, coded ledgers written in a language only a few can understand, and quiet transactions in private banks where anonymity is guaranteed. There is a dreamlike quality to it, a bedtime story for adults, one about power and secrecy and treasure hidden in plain sight. Governments, of course, have tried to find it. Sanctions have been placed on suspected accounts, investigations have been launched into offshore banking networks, and financial transparency laws have been strengthened. And yet, for all of these efforts, Mogilevich remains wealthy. His name still appears on intelligence briefings as a potential financier of illicit operations, proof that his fortune has not been completely dismantled. This enduring mystery has made him a figure of fascination not just for law enforcement but for the public. True crime documentaries speculate about his hidden billions, crime writers use him as inspiration for shadowy masterminds, and journalists continue to chase the story, hoping to uncover the next clue. And each time a new piece of the puzzle is revealed. A seized property here, a shell company exposed there, it only deepens the intrigue. Perhaps this is the most powerful aspect of Mogilevich's wealth, not just its size, but its elusiveness. It is not just money, it is a statement of survival, proof that the man who built one of the largest criminal empires in history has managed to keep its heart beating even when the world has tried to stop it. And so, as listeners drift deeper into this story, they are left with an image that lingers, somewhere, behind locked doors and encrypted accounts, the fortune of Semion Mogilevich waits, silent and untouched, a testament to a life spent outthinking and outmaneuvering the forces that tried to bring him down. The question is not just where the money is, but whether anyone will ever truly find it, or whether it will remain hidden forever, part of the legend that Mogilevich has so carefully built around himself. By the time Semion Mogilevich had become a household name in law enforcement circles, his legend had grown far beyond the cold facts of police reports and financial filings. He was no longer just a man, he was a myth, a figure whose name carried with it an entire constellation of rumors and dark whispers. Some of these stories were rooted in truth, others in speculation, and still others seemed to belong more to spy novels than to real life. But in the world of organized crime, perception can be just as powerful as reality, and Mogilevich seemed to understand that allowing the legend to grow only added to his power. Perhaps the most persistent rumors involved his alleged ties to intelligence agencies. Some claim that Mogilevich had deep connections with the KGB during the final years of the Soviet Union, using their resources to build his early smuggling networks. After the USSR collapsed, these same contacts were said to have migrated into the FSB or private security firms, giving him a pipeline of information that kept him one step ahead of the law. Whether or not he was ever formally recruited is unknown, but the idea that he had friends in high places made him seem almost untouchable. For law enforcement agencies abroad, this rumor was more than just gossip, it was a nightmare scenario. If Mogilevich was protected by elements of the state, then traditional law enforcement methods might never be enough to catch him. Then there were the claims about arms deals. Over the years, reports surfaced suggesting that Mogilevich's network had facilitated weapons sales to conflict zones around the world. Some linked him to arms shipments to Eastern Europe during the Balkan Wars, others to deals in Africa or the Middle East. There were even whispers that his network could procure not just small arms but more advanced weaponry, including components that could be used for nuclear programs. These allegations were never conclusively proven, but the mere suggestion was enough to elevate his status from criminal to potential geopolitical threat. There were financial conspiracies too, claims that Mogilevich had played a role in destabilizing markets, manipulating commodity prices, or laundering money for corrupt governments. Some journalists alleged that his financial operations were so vast that they could influence the economies of entire regions. There were stories of him quietly funding political campaigns, backing certain candidates who would later pass favorable legislation or look the other way when suspicious transactions flowed through the system. Each new rumor added another layer to the legend, making Mogilevich seem less like a man and more like a shadowy force moving behind world events. Even his personal life became a subject of speculation. There were rumors that he had multiple passports, multiple identities, and even multiple families living in different countries. Some claimed he kept a network of safe houses across Europe, each one fully stocked and ready for him to disappear at a moment's notice. Others said he had a private island somewhere, a place where he could retreat if the world became too dangerous. These stories were impossible to verify, but they painted a picture of a man who was always prepared, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Perhaps the most fascinating conspiracies were the ones that blurred the line between crime and politics. Some intelligence analysts suggested that Mogilevich had become so embedded in legitimate systems, from banking to energy to shipping, that he could not simply be removed without causing major disruption. This gave rise to the theory that governments might tolerate his existence, not because they approved of his crimes, but because dismantling his network would be too risky, too destabilizing. If true, this would mean that Mogilevich had achieved something almost unheard of in criminal history, becoming indispensable. For those listening to this story late at night, there is something mesmerizing about these rumors. They transform Mogilevich from a flesh-and-blood man into a symbol, an embodiment of the idea that there are hidden powers shaping the world beyond what most of us can see. Whether true or not, these myths give him a presence that extends far beyond Russia, beyond Budapest, beyond the underworld itself. But myths can also be dangerous. They attract attention, inspire rivals, and create expectations. Some of Mogilevich's enemies may have believed the myths and acted against him out of fear, sparking conflicts that might otherwise have been avoided. And for law enforcement, the legend could sometimes be as much of a distraction as a help, leading them to chase ghosts and theories that were impossible to prove. Yet Mogilevich himself never seemed to publicly dispute these stories. If anything, he allowed them to circulate, perhaps understanding that a reputation for being everywhere, knowing everything, and controlling everyone was its own kind of protection. If people believed he was untouchable, they were less likely to try to touch him. This chapter of his story is less about confirmed facts and more about the way legends are born. The quiet businessman becomes the shadowy kingmaker, the financial genius becomes the puppet master pulling global strings. Whether or not every rumor was true hardly mattered. What mattered was that the name Semion Mogilevich had come to represent something bigger than any single crime. It represented the idea of the perfect criminal, educated, invisible, and forever beyond the reach of the law. As the years went on, these stories only grew. Every time a major financial scandal broke, some wondered aloud if Mogilevich had a hand in it. Every time a mysterious shipment of weapons was intercepted, his name would surface in whispers. It was as though he had become a ghost story for the modern age, the man who might be behind anything and everything, the shadow you could never quite catch. For those falling asleep to this tale, the effect is hypnotic. The idea of a man so powerful, so connected, and so elusive that he could be shaping events right now, somewhere out there, is both chilling and strangely comforting. It suggests that the world is not random, that there are hidden hands guiding it, even if those hands belong to a man once called the most dangerous in the world. And so, the legend of Semion Mogilevich continues to grow, even as the man himself remains quiet, living somewhere far from the public eye. The myths, the conspiracies, the unanswered questions, they have become part of his legacy, ensuring that his name will be spoken with awe, fear, and fascination for years to come. As the years rolled on, the once feared name of Semion Mogilevich began to fade from daily headlines. The man who had once commanded global attention, hunted by the FBI, analyzed by intelligence agencies, and splashed across newspaper covers, seemed to slip into a kind of twilight existence. He was still there, still alive, still a figure of immense influence in whispers and in reports, but his life had slowed. The storms of the 1990s and 2000s had passed, leaving behind a quieter world in which Mogilevich became less a moving target and more a fixture of Moscow's invisible elite. Imagine the Moscow of the 2010s, a city buzzing with new wealth, glittering skyscrapers, and a rising middle class. Luxury cars slid through traffic where Soviet-era Ladas once sputtered. Cafes and restaurants brimmed with chatter about business deals, politics, and art. Somewhere in this vibrant city, Mogilevich was said to live a relatively open life. Not loud, not flamboyant, but not entirely hidden either. He no longer needed to flee across borders or move from safe house to safe house. Instead, he settled into a kind of careful normalcy, as if the game of pursuit had finally come to a stalemate. Reports placed him in comfortable apartments in Moscow, sometimes even in gated communities where security was tight and privacy respected. Neighbors described a man who seemed unremarkable, quiet, polite, often seen with family members. This was not the picture of a fugitive constantly looking over his shoulder. In fact, it was said that he occasionally appeared in public spaces without bodyguards, strolling at a leisurely pace, giving the impression of a man at peace with his surroundings. And yet, those who followed his story knew better than to believe that Mogilevich had become ordinary. The calm exterior hid a mind still as sharp as ever, still keeping track of the world beyond the walls of his home. Even in these quieter years, his name appeared in intelligence briefings, his network still monitored by Western agencies who suspected that his influence had not truly waned. The money still flowed, perhaps less visibly, perhaps more carefully, but it flowed all the same. This phase of his life has an almost reflective quality. The ambition that once drove him to build an empire now seemed tempered by age and experience. There were no new empires to conquer, no need to prove himself. Instead, Mogilevich seemed focused on maintaining stability, on keeping what he had built secure. Those who studied his operations noted that his business dealings appeared to shift toward lower-profile investments, ones less likely to attract international scrutiny. Occasionally, Mogilevich would give interviews, brief, calm, and measured. In one reported instance, he spoke to Russian media, downplaying the Western accusations against him and insisting that he was merely a businessman who had been unfairly targeted. His tone was not defiant but almost weary, as though he had grown accustomed to the endless cycle of allegations and investigations. To hear him speak was to be reminded that beneath the legend was still a man, now older, perhaps slower, but still very much in command of his narrative. For those who had hunted him, these quiet years were frustrating. He remained beyond their reach, shielded by Russia's refusal to extradite him, and yet he was no longer the elusive phantom he once was. Instead of chasing him across Europe, they could now only watch from a distance as he lived his life in relative comfort. Some agents retired without ever getting the chance to put him in a courtroom, leaving behind case files that became part of the FBI's long history of unresolved pursuits. There is something almost cinematic about this part of Mogilevich's story, the image of the aging crime boss, no longer running, simply existing, waiting out his days while the world around him changes. The once feared mastermind is now a man in his 70s, perhaps sitting on a balcony with tea, reading newspapers, and watching the snow fall over Moscow. The empire is quieter, but it is still there, a shadow network that hums softly beneath the surface. For the public, these later years have turned him into an almost mythical figure. People speak of him as though he were a character from a novel, the brilliant strategist who got away, who outlived the chase, who managed to keep his wealth and his freedom long after the world tried to take them from him. His legend only grows as time passes, because mystery has a way of deepening with distance. Of course, danger has never fully disappeared. Rivals still exist, new power players still emerge, and politics in Russia can be unpredictable. But Mogilevich seems to have mastered the art of survival, choosing his battles carefully, keeping a low profile when needed, and staying loyal to the connections that have kept him safe for so long. It is this ability to adapt, to become quieter, less visible, yet still present, that has allowed him to endure where so many others have fallen. For listeners, this chapter has the feel of a long, slow exhale, a pause after decades of tension, a chance to see the man not as a fugitive or a financier but simply as a human being nearing the final act of his life. The story is no longer about chases and arrests but about legacy, about what remains when the game is finally over. And yet, there is still an open question. Is Mogilevich truly retired from the world stage, or does he still have a hand in the quiet movement of billions across continents? Is he a man living out his twilight years in peace, or is he still, even now, the ghost in the machine, pulling strings from the shadows? The lack of a clear answer is perhaps the most fitting ending for this stage of his life. When we speak of Semion Mogilevich today, we are no longer just talking about a man, we are talking about an era, a blueprint, a legacy that changed the way the underworld thinks about power. His name has become a symbol for something far larger than himself, the shift from brute force gangsterism to the sophisticated, boardroom-style operations that now define much of organized crime. His rise and survival were not just personal victories, they reshaped the game itself. Before Mogilevich, much of organized crime, at least in the public imagination, revolved around violence. The classic gangster story was one of racketeering, extortion, and bloody territorial wars. But Mogilevich demonstrated that there was another way. He showed that true power did not have to be loud or visible. It could be quiet, calculating, hidden behind layers of legitimate business and complex financial transactions. He turned crime into a corporate enterprise, with subsidiaries, balance sheets, and global strategy. In doing so, he set the template for a new generation of underworld figures who would follow in his footsteps. Consider how many of today's criminal organizations now look less like street gangs and more like multinational companies. Cartels employ accountants and lawyers. Smuggling operations use encrypted communication systems and offshore banks. Money is laundered through hedge funds, real estate portfolios, and digital currencies. While Mogilevich was not the only architect of this transformation, his influence is undeniable. He proved that crime could be scalable, that it could blend so seamlessly with legitimate economies that dismantling it would be like tearing apart part of the financial system itself. His legacy also lies in the way law enforcement evolved in response to him. The pursuit of Mogilevich forced agencies to think differently, to collaborate across borders, and to invest in financial forensics. The FBI, Europol, and other organizations developed new tools for tracing international wire transfers, identifying shell corporations, and mapping global criminal networks because of cases like his. In a way, Mogilevich's empire became a training ground for modern anti-organized crime efforts, pushing investigators to become as sophisticated as the criminals they were chasing. And yet, for all the progress made, there is still a sense that Mogilevich won. He was never extradited to the United States, never faced trial for the YBM Magnex scandal, and never served a sentence that reflected the scale of his alleged crimes. He outlasted multiple investigations, multiple governments, and multiple attempts to bring him down. This, too, is part of his legacy, the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the system cannot catch its most elusive prey. There is also a psychological legacy to consider. Mogilevich represents a kind of underworld archetype, the mastermind who prefers intellect over intimidation, who treats crime not as chaos but as strategy. This archetype has inspired countless books, films, and television series. The white-collar gangster has become a staple of crime fiction, a figure who manipulates markets and politics with the same ease a street-level boss might manipulate drug corners. In this sense, Mogilevich's story has become part of the cultural fabric, blurring the line between reality and myth. But perhaps the most haunting part of his legacy is the idea that he revealed about the world itself, that the lines between the legal and illegal economies are far thinner than most people would like to believe. Mogilevich's operations thrived not in dark alleys but in boardrooms, stock exchanges, and international banks. His ability to exploit weaknesses in global systems highlighted how vulnerable those systems really are. Even today, governments continue to grapple with money laundering, offshore tax havens, and the influence of shadow capital, issues that Mogilevich exploited with uncanny precision decades ago. For those reflecting on his story late at night, this is where the narrative becomes less about one man's biography and more about what his life says about power itself. Mogilevich showed that power is not just about guns or muscle, it is about information, timing, and the ability to remain invisible until it is too late for anyone to stop you. He demonstrated that in a globalized world, crime can be just as sophisticated as any legitimate corporation, and often more adaptable. And yet, his legacy is not purely one of admiration. There are many who suffered because of his schemes, investors who lost life savings in the YBM fraud, communities destabilized by the criminal networks he empowered, and governments whose institutions were weakened by corruption. For them, his story is not one of cleverness but of predation, a reminder of how devastating it can be when a single man can bend systems to his will. Still, whether one views him with awe or with anger, it is impossible to deny his impact. He changed the rules of the game, and the ripple effects of those changes are still felt today. Every new case of transnational money laundering, every scandal involving offshore accounts, every global investigation into dark money has echoes of the methods Mogilevich perfected. As the man himself grows older and retreats further from public life, his legacy becomes more a question than an answer. How much of the modern shadow economy can be traced back to the blueprint he created? How many of the systems he built are still running, still moving money quietly in the night? And will there ever be a reckoning, a moment when the full truth of his empire is finally revealed? For now, his name remains both a warning and a symbol, a reminder that the underworld is not just a place of violence but a place of strategy, one where the smartest players can build empires that rival those of kings, and sometimes walk away from the table with everything still intact. And so, we arrive at the end of the story, or at least, the end as far as we can follow it. The life of Semion Mogilevich is not one with a neat conclusion, no dramatic courtroom showdown, no final scene where justice is served and the credits roll. Instead, it ends as it has so often unfolded, quietly, in the shadows, leaving us with questions that may never be fully answered. Perhaps that is what makes his story so compelling. Here was a man who built an empire that stretched across continents, who outmaneuvered police forces, intelligence agencies, and governments, and yet never became a household name in the way other crime bosses did. His power was not loud, not theatrical. It was invisible, like the current beneath a river, always moving, shaping events without being seen. The image that lingers is not of a man in handcuffs or a gangster surrounded by muscle, but of an aging figure sitting alone in a quiet room somewhere in Moscow, cigarette smoke rising lazily toward the ceiling, the city lights glowing faintly outside the window. He is not gloating over victory, nor is he haunted by guilt. Instead, he seems to exist in a space beyond both triumph and regret, a man who played the game and, in many ways, beat it. But what does it mean to beat the system? Mogilevich's story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the world we live in. It reminds us that power is often concentrated in places we cannot see, that money moves in channels that most of us will never fully understand, and that those who know how to navigate those channels can become almost untouchable. His survival is both fascinating and unsettling, a testament to human ingenuity and a sobering reminder of the limits of justice. There is a certain poetic symmetry to the way Mogilevich's life unfolded. He began in the gray streets of post-war Kiev, a child of a system that taught him to be cautious, to be clever, to find ways around obstacles. He built his empire in the chaos of the Soviet collapse, turning disorder into opportunity. He reached the peak of his power not with bloodshed but with balance sheets, proving that the pen, or the contract, can indeed be mightier than the sword. And now, as the years stretch on, he fades into a kind of legend, a story told in whispers, a case study in what it means to operate in the shadows. For some, his story is one of admiration, the brilliant strategist who outsmarted everyone, the man who stayed ahead of the game until the end. For others, it is a cautionary tale about greed, corruption, and the failure of institutions meant to protect ordinary people from exploitation. Perhaps it is both at once, a story that refuses to be simplified into hero or villain, black or white. As you lie there, listening to this story unfold in the quiet of the night, there is something almost hypnotic about its unresolved nature. We are so used to endings that tie everything together, but Mogilevich's tale does not grant us that satisfaction. Instead, it leaves us with a lingering unease, a question mark that hovers in the dark. What if he is still out there, still pulling strings, still moving money in ways that shape the world around us? And maybe that is the final lesson of Semion Mogilevich's life. Power, true power, does not always announce itself. It moves quietly, without fanfare, without headlines. It endures not because it is invincible but because it is adaptable, always shifting, always one step ahead. The man they called the most dangerous in the world may never face a courtroom, may never have his day of reckoning, but his story will continue to echo, reminding us that some forces are too complex to ever be fully contained. As the story fades, imagine the snow falling outside a Moscow apartment, blanketing the streets in silence. Somewhere, perhaps, Mogilevich sits in the half-light, his face illuminated by the soft glow of a lamp, his thoughts known only to himself. The world beyond his window continues to turn, governments rise and fall, markets boom and crash, but he remains, as he has always been, a man apart. And so we close this chapter, not with a bang but with a whisper, leaving you with the feeling that the story is not over, that perhaps it never truly will be. Semion Mogilevich's legacy lives on, in the systems he exploited, in the myths he inspired, and in the quiet reminder that sometimes, the most powerful figures in the world are the ones we cannot see. Sleep now, with the story lingering like smoke in the air, knowing that somewhere, in the shadows of history, the ghost of Semion Mogilevich is still out there, watching, waiting, and reminding us that the underworld does not always stay beneath our feet. Sometimes, it walks among us.